holds my attention is that here we are, United Nations building behind us, the world leaders are convening, and yet the leading voice of the choir is clearly Greta Thunberg. They've all been echoing a protest.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that it's taking a child to actually cut through all the rubbish and the noise and tell the truth. And I think that's, in this particular topic, we do need to trust the children's voices. And as you've seen in the film I put together, we interviewed about 110 children from around the world. And I was just astonished at how eloquent they are on this topic, how connected they are to what's happening. They still have an intuitive sense of that connection to nature and what we're doing to the planet, and they just can't understand that we've lost that. So I think they're calling us all out on that to get back to that part of us and understand the damage we're doing, and in particular because they're going to be around. When a lot of us are gone, they're still going to have to live with the consequences of the action that those people are taking today. And I think that's why even this morning we saw her be particularly brave and sort of say, stop doing this. Stop living this fairy tale that constant economic growth is going to work. And I think that's the dilemma, is that our leaders are caught within a game, within a system that's been rolling along for so long. They really don't know how to unravel themselves out of that. It's a very complicated, wicked problem.
You have three main game changers, the states. You have also the private sector, the companies, and at the same time the civil movement, the citizens. Who do you think will be ultimately the great catalyst for change?
Well, I think if you reference history, that throughout history it's always been the civilians that have taken to the streets and created the change, and then others follow. And if you go back to the abolitionists, they were 60 years before slavery ended, they were told to get off the streets. It was utopian to think that the economy would ever survive without slaves. It was impossible, but they just kept going. They built in number, they used all sorts of tactics and eventually won. The suffragettes were the same, or I think even the President of America in 1904, a guy named Grover Cleveland said to women, no sensible woman wants to vote. They've got to leave the decisions to the men. This is a president of the United States, and look what happened to the women's vote. So I think we're in a very similar time right now where we've got these kids really driving this change, and we're seeing a lot of corporations start to respond now because they know, and we've done screenings for lots of banks that say their customers are writing to them saying, what are you doing about climate change? What are you doing with our money, our investments? You have to make a change. So I think it's sort of going to happen that way. The corporates are going to respond, and then sadly I think the governments will be last to respond, especially in my country, in Australia. It's really frustrating how far behind we are. And America obviously makes a massive difference what they do. So I think we're going to see this continue to grow. The children I've met in Australia and around the world aren't going to stop. They're going to keep going until their voices are heard, and I think it's a very exciting time to be alive, to be in the middle of quite a historic transition.
Language constructs ideology. Can you extend on that?
Yeah, so a really important part of making 2040 for me was to almost develop and create a new language, a new metaphor for how we interact with the planet. How do we talk about it? I think one of the pitfalls, I guess, of the way climate change has been discussed is it's in language that doesn't connect to us as humans. We talk about 1.5 degrees, anthropogenic, negative emissions. Most people just tune off from those. They don't stir the soul and invoke any sort of meaning or passion. So I really wanted the film to try and come back to that level as humans. What will inspire us to move forward? And it is our children, it is clean air, and it is valuing our home, not seeing this as a planet that's separate from us, but understanding that whatever we do to it intrinsically affects our own lives as well, and trying to change that metaphor. This issue really, unfortunately, has become political, and it never should have been political. And if you look at what we did with the Montreal Protocol when we had to deal with the ozone layer, everyone just got together and solved the problem because they realised it benefited all of us. And I think if you look in the late 80s, you had Margaret Thatcher, you had George Bush Sr. addressing the UN, both Republican, bastions of Republican or right-wing politics, saying this is the most important issue we'll ever face. But then the Exxons and the Shell, they started to hijack that narrative, start to put out these messages that it was all not true, and the whole thing's descended into this political mess. So I think if we're going to get out of it, we have to start using a language that doesn't politicise, and it's about talking about our children. As you said, any world leader can relate to that. What kind of world do we actually want for all of our children? Let's actually try and unite on that.
In media, we're always tempted to go the apocalyptic way. You didn't.
Yeah, I think that we're so bombarded with apocalyptic images of our future. Even Hollywood films. Every Hollywood film depicts a future with robots chasing humans in slums. There's no nature. And I think if we're not careful, we'll march into that version of the future because it's almost, those images are planted in our subconscious. So again, I guess I just wanted to try and have an intervention on that and say it doesn't have to be like that. We do have choices to go a very different way and to create a very flourishing, vibrant, rich with nature future, and start actually using those images to try and inspire people and say, yeah, that's what I want to live in, or that's what I want for my children. So, and again, there's really interesting psychology around that we are motivated by the idea of a hopeful future. It's, it's Viktor Frankl's work, The Man's Search for Meaning. It's that's what moves us forward, is the idea of a better outcome. And at the moment, all we're getting is how bad things are. And it's important to acknowledge the reality of the situation. We do need to urgently act. But I think it can be paralysing for a lot of people. A lot of people need to hear the solutions, and then they can get involved and they know where to take action.
And we can sum it up as fact-based dreaming.
Yeah, so obviously the whole journey I do in the film is called fact-based dreaming, because I didn't want it to be this utopian, fanciful vision of the future that, wouldn't it be great if all this happened? Everything I show my daughter in the future has to exist now. So it can't be made up. It's just an extrapolation of what we already have, which again was one of the best takeaways from making this film and spending 4 years on it, was that we've got everything we need. It's all here right now. We just need the motivation, the will, and the right education to bring people on and want to tell that story. The energy was a big one. Obviously it's the most talked about, it's the most in the forefront of the mainstream, and we know that there is a sort of transition to renewables happening anyway around the world. That's already out of control, and it's going to be inevitable. But this solution more looks at the way we structure that energy. So are we going to stick with the more top-down hierarchical structure that we have right now? Whereas in many of these countries, they're starting to decentralise that energy system, which means that the money stays within the community. People are buying and selling their energy from each other, almost like a currency. So it gets to empower and strengthen people at a local level. And I think especially as we move forward with the climate mitigation, all the things we're going to face, the more we can empower people at a local level, and they're not relying on a centralised grid which is going to break down regularly. These people, it just felt like the right solution to tell. And that is spreading through Bangladesh, India, Africa, and even in my country in Australia, there's lots of tests now where people are doing microgrids within communities to do exactly the same thing.
Now, people don't come into the grips that agriculture, their food source, is actually the most contaminant of all.
Yeah. Agriculture's a topic that probably doesn't get enough attention in the mainstream media. That our current practice that it's really deleterious for the planet. So whether it's constant ploughing of the soil, which puts the carbon into the atmosphere, the food waste, which if it was a country would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, the amount of food we throw away, almost 40% of our food around the world we just throw away. So we could get much more efficient there. Even our livestock practices at the moment are emitting lots of different carbon. But what's emerging now is something called regenerative agriculture, which really flips that whole industry on its head and starts to pull the carbon from the atmosphere back down into the soil. And once you do that, you just get this raft of benefits that we just should be doing, because it improves the quality of our food, the way that the soils hold the water, which is incredible, and even the way that we're rotating the livestock to use them to actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's to the point that we don't really have to all give up meat. The type of meat we eat becomes really important, and there are types of practices of raising the cattle that can actually benefit the planet. So it means we have to cut down. We can't eat the same amount we are now, but if we could choose the right types of meat, it would have a really incredible effect.
And you said it in the documentary, there's one that actually blew your mind. It blew mine too when I saw it. So if you combine educating of girls and family planning, it's actually the #1 solution to climate change. So the statistics from the UN show that if a girl doesn't get to complete her education, she's taken out of school for family matters or religion or put to work, which often happens in not just developing countries, but even in wealthier nations. She'll probably have 5 or more children. But if she gets to complete her education, and is given access to health, reproductive health services and work opportunities, she'll get to choose when and how many children she has, and that number comes down to 2. So that difference between 2 or 5 or more children means by 2050 it's a decrease of 1.1 billion people. And so, look, we should be empowering girls and women anyway, that's a great thing, but to think we also get this bonus on our resource use and climate change, we should just be getting on with that solution. Trickle-down politics. Are we in a change of paradigm? And I mentioned trickle-down politics because particularly Chile, not so much Australia, but Chile particularly, we were the children of the Chicago Boys coming out of here. And now we are becoming the country that has more B Corps per capita in the world.
That's great.
But you found there something that was rather obscene.
Yeah, I think that the trickle-down story we've been told right around the world is proving to be false now. I think there's evidence enough everywhere that I think if you look at the statistics that over the last 3 decades, just 5% of the wealth has made it to the bottom 60% of humanity, and 95% of that wealth has stayed with the top 40%. So there's this huge disparity, and we now have 4.3 billion people living under $5 a day. I mean, that's a fail. That's an absolute fail. We'll debate this poverty line and whatnot, and people argue that it's not right, it's $1.90. But the reality is that many people, almost half the population, are living under $5 a day. So this myth that we're going to, rise all these people from poverty is just rubbish. And even if we kept going at these current rates, it would take 207 years to get those people above $5 a day, and the economy would have to grow 135 times its current size. And that wipes out every living thing on the planet. So this story is what Greta called everyone out this morning, this fairy tale of constant economic growth on a finite planet. We just can't do it. We're already using double the amount of resources on this planet that we can replenish in a single year. And the trajectory is we'll be using 3 times that amount by 2050. But no one's having that conversation. That's probably the most important factor. How are we going to slow down this machine? Because even all the solar panels we're building, they're not keeping up with the demand for new energy that we're also creating. So it's like filling a hole with sand that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And again, no one is willing to have that conversation. And I think that's probably why Greta called it out this morning.
Do you overthrow the system or do you change the system?
Oh, you have to change. I don't think you can be militant about this thing. I think we have to be very careful, is that a lot of people don't understand this. We have to meet people where they're at. And I don't think we're going to suddenly invent a new system. And that's going to take a long time to transition. But we just have to think of clever ways that we can transition it, which is to not just measure everything by money. We know we don't value that. GDP is the most ridiculous way to measure what we're doing to our society.
Why?
We need to,
Okay.
because it only factors in the money. It doesn't look at the way we're destroying forests, the way we're destroying communities when large, Walmarts move into town. It's not factoring all these other things that we value and hold dear as humans. We're not all just obsessed with money. We like other things, but they're not measured as our success. So I think that's the first thing we can do, is start making policy and decisions that adhere to a wider lens, that are about the environment, are about strengthening communities, are about growth if we need to, but in the right areas that are regenerative for the planet, not growth in areas that are destroying the planet. And I'd say the same socially. If we get income inequality gaps that are as big as they are now, which is almost back to aristocracy days, we're going to see social unrest, which we're seeing around the world. So we just need some safe boundaries, some planetary boundaries and social boundaries that keep us within the limits that ensures our survival. We can still do all the things we need to do, but let's just be sensible about it.
Are we in a revolution, in the midst of a revolution, a change, a substantial change of paradigm, if you will? Not only by the internal combustion engine, but also a change of paradigm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we are. I think there's some really interesting work by Jonathan Salk, and he talks about that we're in an intersection point now. So we're coming out of an old paradigm that was post-war, that was all about growth and development, and that was the way to prosperity. And it's meeting up with this younger generation that are saying, we can't keep growing on a finite planet. We've got climate change. Our oceans are full of plastic. And these two ideologies are starting to clash. So I guess you could say that is a revolution, that there's this crossover now starting to happen, where leaders are being forced by the younger generation to really look at their actions and look at what they're doing and find, viable solutions. And as I said before, these children aren't going to stop. They're going to keep going. They know that this world is the one they're going to be inheriting, and they want it to look fundamentally different to how it's looked over the last 30 or 40 years.